Welcome back. Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene will deliver his midterm budget tomorrow, and with no real fiscal space to manoeuvre within, Nene is expected to continue to keep a lid on spending. Spending and revenue targets are expected to be lowered in the wake of much slower growth in the economy. Well, to talk fiscal matters, I'm joined in studio by Azar Jammine. He's Chief Economist at Econometrix. Thank you very much, Dr. Jammine, for joining us.
Thank you, Nompo.
Now, it's crunch time for Mr. Nene. What will he have to be saying tomorrow to give the markets confidence that he's going to manage to balance his books properly?
You know, as you said, he's going to have to convey a message that economic growth has not been as good as they had hoped, and that government revenue is falling short, and that as a consequence he has to be very strict on spending. But, you know, he has to also exude a sense of confidence. This is his first public budgetary statement, and it follows from two predecessors that were, let's face it, quite impressive. And so he will need to try and come in and fill their shoes to the same extent, to a similar extent, and give people the feeling that, you know, don't worry, there's been a change in the finance ministry, but it's still a very solid institution, and they are going to try and keep a lid on spending.
So how does he manage to do that? Is it through the flair with which he delivers, or the substance?
Unfortunately, it's both. The substance will be important. People will have to understand that there is going to be a tight rein on spending, but it's also the flair with which he comes across it and actually tells people, you know, I'm going to be firm about this. I'm not going to let spending go through the floor. And this is particularly relevant right now, where there is a demand by public sector unions for a 15% salary hike, which is clearly unaffordable.
Now, Eskom, South African Airways, South African Express, South African Post Office, these are real bugbears for government right now. Is it a waste of money for government to keep on recapitalizing these organizations?
You know, it really depends on which institution you're talking about. Some of them are a waste of money, others are not such a waste of money. There is no question that some areas such as electricity and having a national airline, you know, there is some sense in having such a strategy. But when it comes to the post office, after what we're seeing right now, you wonder whether we shouldn't just privatize the whole thing as they've done in Britain. It's been done particularly well. Does it really need to be a national entity, nationalized entity? And that's the kind of issue that it's quite complex. And one hopes, though, there is a sense in which people have been speculating on the possibility of the government selling off some non-core assets that are not strategic to remain in the hands of the government, and to raise funds through that to help finance vital areas such as Eskom.
But from what you know, if government were to go ahead with that strategy of selling off non-core assets, are there enough of them to actually plug the massive gaps that are there in all of these state-owned enterprises? I
think one shouldn't underestimate how much money there is stuck in there. And besides, there's also a lot of government property that is lying idle that could also be sold.
Now, why do people get excited about South Africa having debt levels that are verging onto 50% when you've got countries like Japan, US, and some European states that actually have debt that's in the triple-digit territory? Why are
let me take you through this. Okay. Firstly, the government's debt, it may be 45-50% of GDP. On top of that, you've got to add the potential debts of Eskom and Transnet and all that. Then you get closer to 65% of GDP. But then you've also got to take into consideration that our long-term interest rates are in the region of 8.5%, whereas in most developed economies they're in the region of 2%. So in other words, the amount of interest we pay relative to our GDP, even with a total debt, public debt of 65% of GDP, is even greater than that which Japan pays, with a debt of 240% of GDP, where their long-term interest rates are 1% compared with ours 8.5%. And as a consequence, the interest bill on our government debt at the moment accounts for, I think, 9.2% of total government spending, and is set to rise by some 11-12% per year for the next 3 years, crowding out all other areas of government spending, such as education and healthcare. So we cannot afford to allow that public, it's not only the absolute level, but we cannot afford to allow the level of the debt to rise, because all that we'll end up doing is paying more and more interest.
Now, we touched on market reaction, and we know that the ratings agencies have said that they're watching very closely. What do you think they'll be looking at tomorrow when Nhlanhla Nene delivers his speech?
Well, they will be looking at what we're all looking at. Is he determined to control spending? And then secondly, and most importantly, if we carry on growing at 1.5%, we are in deep trouble, because then he has to cut down on government spending in coming years, even more so than he's done, in order to prevent debt levels rising. So the obvious solution, the more positive solution, is to try and boost economic growth. How do we do that? The way is to attack the structural impediments to economic growth at the moment, such as the lack of education, the labour market environment, the regulatory environment that is so stifling, the inability to embark upon infrastructural spending, increasing levels of corruption, the ineptitude of much of municipal service delivery, and the lack of trust between public and private sectors. Now, there is a program that addresses all of these, and it's called the National Development Plan. But it is being opposed from many sectors within government, factions within government. And Nene has to come across strongly to say, I couldn't care what you guys are saying. This is government policy, and we're going to go ahead with it. And for that promise to become more credible than it has been lately.
Well, let's watch this space tomorrow and see whether he's able to do that. Thank you, Dr. Jammine. That was Dr. Azar Jammine. He's Chief Economist at Econometrix.